Thank you, Gabriele. Thank you, everybody who's come. I'm very grateful to Universidad de Esperides for inviting me to present the book here. If my voice crackles a little bit from time to time, it's because a few of us are down with a bit of a cold at the moment. So this book is about large-scale coordination schemes, specifically the coordination of a civil order. And I'd like to give a few background comments to kind of situate the project, give a bit of context. First of all, what is a civil order? A civil order arises when individuals who participate in diverse projects and organizations and associations, starting with the family, what are often called private associations, feel a need to meet their necessities, to meet their interests, to fulfill their interests by cooperating with other groups, other organizations, that are situated normally within a given territory. Historically, civil orders comes from the idea of civitas or town, and so the city or the town is a natural basis or sort of headquarters for a civil order, right? So a civil order has this aspect of territoriality, and it has this aspect of publicity, meaning that it goes beyond the life of small organizations and associations. Now, there are two conceptions of large-scale coordination. One is as a coordination game between individuals, which is very familiar to us because it's a very modern way of thinking about coordination. And another as a coordination game between groups that have to enter into interaction with each other. They have to form common projects. Modern theories of the state, starting with people like Hobbes, Locke, then Kant, Rousseau, and others, typically dominated by the idea of a coordination game between individuals. Okay, so if you read the modern theorists of the state, you will probably notice that the actors are typically mostly individuals. And they will talk about other actors, group actors, like churches, in a very suspicious kind of way, as kind of a potential threat. But they're very dominated by this kind of individualistic account of coordination. And this is in many ways what gives rise to the pathologies of statism. Because modern statism, both the practice and the theory of the modern state, in many ways, is premised on this individualistic conception of social coordination. Now, if you see society as a bunch of individuals making deals and contracts and coordinating with each other, then you will probably end up with a theory of political order that is inadequate to the reality of social life. Because social life is a complex arena of many, many different group projects, right? Group endeavors that have to be somehow coordinated. And each group has its own distinctive mission, its own distinctive values and goals. And it's a very, very tricky matter to get all of these group projects to somehow interact productively within a shared space. And the outcome of this individualistic approach to order is the idea of a sovereign state, a state that has general purpose, overarching authority in society. And that figure of the sovereign state, which is imperfectly reflected in our political practices, not fully reflected because it's impossible to exercise full sovereignty. But the effort to reflect that doctrine of sovereignty has resulted in has contributed greatly to a series of dysfunctions that we're seeing playing out in modern states. The welfare state, for example, is notoriously dysfunctional in Western countries. It has elements of functionality, but also in the long run, it's becoming increasingly dysfunctional. It's mismanaged, or let's just say it's not managed adequately. There is not value for money. The funding model is also insufficient because of the demographic crisis. Our societies are becoming more polarized, progressively more polarized religiously, ideologically. And so there's a crisis of legitimacy because there's a kind of a conflict among citizens about how to define their civic identity, how to define their national identity. So we need to rethink the constitution of civil order in a way that does justice to the ecology, the social ecology, in a way that does justice to group life, the prerogatives and claims of groups, and that is not individualistic, reductively individualistic. And the outcome of this project that I undertake in the book, basically there are two fruits mainly. The first is a deeper understanding of the pathologies of sovereign authority. And the second is a preliminary account of a polycentric civil order. Preliminary account. So it is preliminary, but I think it starts a conversation. So in the few minutes I have here, we're going to start by identifying some features of a good society. What is a good society? Second, I'm going to explain how the modern state and its legitimating ideology corrupts the kind of society that supports the freedom to flourish, the good society. Third, I'm going to dig into the narrative undergirding the sovereign state, the social contract narrative, and show how that blinds us to the social ecology of human flourishing. And fourth, I'll offer a very quick sketch of some features of the Polycentric Republic. It's important to do the kind of critical work rather than just present the positive account, because the idea of sovereign order, sovereign state-based order, is so endemic in modern philosophy, modern political philosophy and practice, that it has become normalized, extremely normalized. And so we have to denormalize the idea of sovereign rule. And the only way to do that is to deconstruct the ideology that justifies it. So to begin with, there is a kind of social ontology, a normative social ontology at work in this book. An ideal of the good society. The good society supports and protects the freedom to flourish. Now, the freedom to flourish, as I explain in the book, is the ability of a person to fully develop their potential as a human being in a way that is responsive to their own rational judgments. Not only their own flourishing, but also the flourishing of their community. And this means that flourishing cannot be imposed, cannot simply be imposed or produced by another actor for me. It's something that I have to participate in a rational way. I have to actually construct my own project. I have to construct my own life project, not from scratch, obviously, and in cooperation with others, but my agency is essential to my flourishing. So flourishing can never be something that is just received by another. So how can a society protect the freedom to flourish? The liberal answer, at least the standard, more influential liberal answer, is through rules and institutions that protect individuals from domination and abuse, which is a kind of an idea of, negative freedom. So we protect the individual from domination by other individuals, other groups, or even by the state itself through constitutions, with separation of powers and so on. But this answer is important, this answer is important, but it's insufficient because it overlooks the need for a rich social ecology that is a plurality of normative orders that can support human flourishing in different ways. So it's not sufficient to have a society in which individuals are not dominated. We need a society that is pluralistic, whose structures are pluralistic and consistent with a rich array of different kinds of social projects and economic projects. And the reason for this is because human flourishing is complex and has many dimensions. And so just as an example, I explain this in the book as well. An example could be, you think about certain kinds of economic association, like say a business. Or if we think of something like compare, say, a consulting business to a university. A consulting business wants to provide certain kinds of services, very specific kinds of services. And it trains its employees or brings in employees who have that kind of that skill set to be able to provide that advice to companies or clients. And a university, one of the fundamental, let's say, goals of a university is to pursue the truth jointly with other people. And if the university becomes a business, then it becomes predominantly a business. Universities are businesses, of course. I'm not denying that. But if the business aspect of the enterprise becomes too dominant, then the whole mission of the university becomes distorted, okay? Because it starts to take on the attributes of a straightforward business. If you look for spiritual salvation in your chess club, you might be disappointed. And it has to do with the way it's structured, the goals of the organization, the ethos of the organization, and so on. It's not fit for purpose if that's what you're looking for. Every organization has its own distinctive flavor, its own distinctive values, its own distinctive, let's say, narrative, collective narrative, self-understanding. And in many ways, this is commonsensical. And there is no way to combine all normative orders into one common order without diluting and sacrificing those orders. And so if you think of the administrative state and you think of how it regulates, the regulations of a vertical state can disrupt the distinctive normative orders of different groups and associations. So we've talked about what a good society is and how it requires a complex social ecology, right, that is irreducibly plural. Now, we need to talk a bit about the modern state and its pathologies. The problem with the modern sovereign state is that it generates modes of governance and regulation that are hostile to the social ecology of flourishing because of its tendency to co-opt and homogenize rival normative orders, such as those of schools and universities. And the reason it does this is because of the incentives of rulers the powers that they possess and the legitimating ideology that they have also to hand. So a modern state has a monopoly over, not a perfect monopoly, but it has in many domains a quasi-monopoly over many aspects of social regulation and economic regulation. It has a monopoly over the means of coercion. It has a monopoly over public finances. And on top of these monopolies, it also has an ideology that tells us that it is the supreme and general purpose coordinator of society, sovereign. It is the sovereign actor in society. And this combination of regulatory, coercive, and financial powers or monopolies with an ideology, a sovereigntist ideology, is a recipe for an expansionist and ever-growing expansionist state that reaches its tentacles further and further into the fabric of social life. Now, why is it so expansionist? Well, obviously monopolies tend to expand over time because they don't have viable competitors. So it's just normal for it to expand over time. But also the legitimating ideology that it's based on, which is that we need to have some actors who are sovereign in society that have this general purpose, overarching power, is such a general, open-ended concept that it is easily interpreted in a way that is expansive. So for example, public health, right? We have a few of us who are sick today, so I'll just mention this, public health. It seems to fall under the jurisdiction of a civil authority to promote, protect public health. If you have a plague or a pandemic, it would seem logical for the sovereign ruler to take charge of that particular area. But of course, if you give monopolistic power over public health to a sovereign, to a particular actor, then who is going to interpret the scope of that power? The actor in question. The actor in question will interpret the scope of the power because there is no competition. If there's not really a healthy competition of public health regulators, then, and you have one that has the privileged position of commanding public health regulations, then it can easily interpret its power as expansively as it wishes, and because it seems to be, on its face, a vital public interest. And so, especially if you can invoke an emergency of some sort, and then the emergency can be normalized as well. So biosurveillance is one interpretation of the sovereign power of the state to regulate public health. What's stopping the state from interpreting its power as a power of biosurveillance? Unless there's real world actors who can push back and claim a rival jurisdiction or authority over public health, it's almost impossible to second guess the state's claims over that kind of area. And we can multiply it and consider lots of other areas like security, terrorism, etc. That this presumption of sovereignty is basically very dangerous and has these very expansive tendencies because of human incentives, normal human incentives to expand. Public officials have an incentive to expand their power. They're human beings. And while I believe in virtue and I aspire to virtue, I also believe that any sound political theory has to take into account the human tendency to self-aggrandizement, narcissism, etc., will to power, and so on. Now, so we've talked about what is a good society, the importance of the social ecology. We've talked about the modern sovereign state, its expansive tendencies, and ultimately its tendency to impose a one-size-fits-all order upon society to the detriment of the distinctive missions of different associations, such as schools and universities. That story is unpacked in greater detail in the book, but I'm just giving you a little flavor of it here. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the ideology behind the sovereign state. And basically, there is an influential story that has been told by modern theorists like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Kant in different forms that says that the people consent to the creation of a government or a state that will represent their will and their interests and govern over society on their behalf. It's a very familiar story, I think, to all of us. And it was a surprise to me. It's nice when you're doing political theory and you're actually surprised by something, because sometimes you have an agenda and you have an idea that's already worked out and you're just sort of unpacking it. But sometimes while you're doing research and thinking and writing, you have a kind of a eureka moment or a kind of a surprise moment. The more I thought about this social contract narrative, the more I wondered what happened to all the associations? What happened to the guilds? What happened to the cities? What happened to the municipalities? What happened to the churches and the parishes? What happened to the schools and universities in this story? Because the story is a story of individuals coming together. In the case of Hobbes, heads of families coming together and forming a social contract. And I thought, how is it possible that this story about the constitution of civil order and a civil government would leave out the jungle of associations that makes up the fabric of society? And whatever the reasons for that, I think there's a strategic reason for leaving them out, which is that it's much easier to justify a sovereign power if you leave out the associations, because it's more natural for individuals, it's more rational for isolated individuals to agree to a sovereign state. Because if they're in a state of anarchy or chaos or insecurity, constant insecurity, and their options on the table are remain in a state of nature where your property and your person are constantly vulnerable, or hand over your power to a sovereign state to protect you, it's rational to favor the sovereign state over a state in which we're all in this state of precariousness as individuals. But if we have the protection of a whole bunch of different types of associations that meet our needs in different ways, then probably we would not be as well disposed towards handing over power to a sovereign state. We might want a more of a distributed power that would respect the prerogatives of our associations. But conveniently, in the contract story, all those prerogatives are just wiped aside because the stakeholders are conceived as freestanding individuals. Is there a realistic alternative? I believe there is. But we cannot recognize it until we free ourselves from the imaginary of monocentrism, of sovereigntism, of statism in its modern form. And that's why these previous steps are important, to try to expose the limits of the social contract story and show that it's kind of left out this important element of the ecology of social ecology of human flourishing. The alternative that I sketch in the book is an emergent civil order. Okay, it's not really designed from the top down. It emerges from lots of different, let's say, agreements and contracts that different groups come to. Some of them are territorial, like municipalities. Others are non-territorial, like could be churches, could be universities, schools, professional associations, and so on. And the actors in this emergent civil order are, of course, individual citizens. And then there are non-territorial associations, like this one here, this university. We are in a territory, but it's not defined by the limits of territory. So the membership of Universidades Perides is not defined by their residency, okay? It's defined by their relation to the mission of the university, activities of the university, which is non-territorial association. And then there's territorial associations, like municipalities, regional communities, and so on. And to give you a little flavor of, there's a book that there's a few copies of the book there in case anyone wants to look at it, that I circulated. But a few of the core features. First, there's a shared civic culture of mutual tolerance and respect for the rule of law. Without the civic culture, everything else is going to fall apart. It's not going to work. Second, a constitutional right to self-regulation for social bodies and local associations, both territorial and non-territorial. A constitutionally protected right to self-regulation that would go much further than what we consider to be today to be the right of self. A presumption on behalf of the right to regulate with respect to internal matters of an association. And then there's a bottom-up constitutional control of civil authority, meaning that the civil authority is not imposed by diktat or by fiat of a sovereign, but rather the civil authority is authorized through a bottom-up constituent process, starting with the non-territorial associations and citizens which legitimate local municipal level of government, and the municipal level of government can then legitimate a regional government, or it could directly legitimate also a federal government. But normally, typically, there's a kind of a scale going up from the bottom to the top. And the top is not actually the top in the way we typically think of it, because the federal government would have robust controls, ongoing robust controls from the bottom. And one of those controls is the right of secession. And so if things are going sideways, and if the federal government is becoming too oppressive or tyrannical, or is expropriating people through apparently illicit means, then what happens is, or illicit, depending, it doesn't matter. You can use the law to do lots of crazy things and lots of unjust things. Then there is this kind of threat, menace of secession hanging over the head of the federal government. And so the federal government has to be on its toes. It's kept on its toes by that threat. Coming to the end now, a wide dispersion of civil authority, that's implied already. If each territorial organization is self-governing at the local level, then logically you're going to have a wide dispersion of civil authority, right? And the same goes for non-territorial units, which self-regulate. Parallel and overlapping jurisdictions, so they wouldn't be completely separate, because it's not polycentric if they're separate. If they're totally separate, it's not a polycentric order. It's just separate orders. But polycentricity entails a shared space where you can enter into contracts with others. You have this kind of mutual exchange, a shared market, some kind of shared values, etc. Mobility and right of exit. And that's also fundamental, because if there's no mobility, there's no political market. You're trapped, much like people were trapped in feudal times in particular relationships. You cannot escape them. So you need to guarantee interregional mobility and also right of exit from associations. And of course, for this to be robust polycentricity, robust governmental polycentricity, it means no governing body is sovereign over the rest. There can be no sovereign governing body that has monopoly over coercive force, that can preemptively decide or can impose its will on the rest. That cannot be a feature of a polycentric society. And to conclude, there are historic examples which we can discuss in the Q&A such as the Swiss Confederation, the Hanseatic League, which were very interesting kinds of models of polycentric order with no central government, but they did have assemblies, okay, but they didn't have any state apparatus, the Hanseatic League, for example. I believe that this book is relevant, has a special relevance for our present moment, because we live in a world that is rapidly specializing, fragmenting, and polarizing in many different ways. And the state has become a kind of a monster, a monstrous kind of, let's say, figure that attempts to regulate a complex and fragmented social order, and is increasingly finding that it cannot do so in an effective way. And I think the dysfunctions, both technical and civic dysfunctions of our current state-based order, make it very timely for us to start thinking very seriously about how to constitute an adaptive, flexible, complex, polycentric civil order. Thank you.